This is All India Radio, documenting biodiversity. Tonight, we bring you an interview with Dr. Madhav Gadgil, Center for Ecological Sciences, Indian Institute of Science, Bangalore. Interviewing him is Sharita Rai, Special Correspondent, Indian Express.
We are happy to have you here with us at the All India Radio Studios, Dr. Madhav Gadgil. You are a well known environmental scientist, noted for your ecological concerns, and an academic best known for your crusades in this regard. The latest initiative being undertaken by your Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science here is clearly an innovative project meant to enlist people's support in documenting Karnataka's rich and vast biodiversity. In this context, would you say that such innovative modules for collecting and documenting data on our biodiversity is not only favorable but necessary in coming decades when intellectual property rights and patents will govern the trade regimes in which biotechnologies will account for nearly 40% of the world economy?
Yes, I believe that technological developments over last 40 years or so have now come to a stage at which it has become very important that we keep good track of our wealth of biological resources and attempt to bring in regimes of their proper conservation, sustainable use, uh, because India now is a party to an international convention on biological diversity to which most countries in the world have subscribed, which recognizes the sovereign rights of each country over its biological resources. And of course, these sovereign rights will have no particular meaning unless we have proper documentation of what those resources over which we are claiming sovereign rights are. And India, in a sense, one of the world's top 12 biodiversity countries, is fortunate in that it has a reasonably good basis of documentation of its biological resources. Nevertheless, it is still very weak. Probably as many as 4/5 of India's living organisms remain to be described, and much of the documentation has been done in the past by scientists abroad. Most of our specimens of biological material are deposited in museums abroad rather than in India. There is a great deal that we need to do to properly document our resources.
In this context, could you briefly describe for our listeners the nature of the pilot project being inaugurated by the noted environmentalist Dr. Shivram Karanth, I believe on June 5th?
Yes. Now, there are two aspects to this documentation, which are in fact suggested by the Convention on Biological Diversity. Not only does this convention say that biological resources are sovereign properties of a country, it also says that the countries which are party to this convention are committed to involving the local communities in continuing conservation and in sharing benefits of the use of these resources with the local communities. I have found over the years that a great deal of the knowledge of these resources, in fact, even today lies entirely with the local communities. Take freshwater fishes, for instance. There is, of course, limited amount of information with the scientific communities on the freshwater fishes of Karnataka as a whole. But if you ask about what we know of the freshwater fishes and what's happening to the freshwater fauna in a given river, say Sharavati, then there is no scientific documentation really available. It is the local fisher folk who have been fishing Sharavati river for last 30, 40 years, each of them over their lives, who know intimately what fishes are there, how they have been changing, which of these species might be in difficulties, which might even have become extinct. So there is the vast storehouse of knowledge like this with the local communities. The project in which we have been involved tries to develop symbiotic relationships between the scientific community and what we may call the practical ecologists. It tries to marry the scientific knowledge of, say, freshwater fishes or medicinal plants of the state with the knowledge of the local fisher folk or the local minor forest produce collectors and so on, who know a great deal about these resources. The attempt is to get the village communities working with local colleges, biologists teaching in those colleges, biology students, perhaps teachers in high schools, but also linked to institutions of higher research such as our institute or botanical and zoological surveys, and the local communities, all of them to work together to prepare proper documentation of local biodiversity, what is happening to it, how it might be conserved. This exercise we are calling People's Biodiversity Registers, and the function planned for June 5th, over which Dr. Shivram Karant will be presiding, would be to present to the local village community of a village called Mala in Karkala Taluk in Dakshin Kannada, a People's Biodiversity Register for that village, prepared by teachers of biology and students of biology from Bhonendra College in Karkala, but working very actively with the whole different knowledgeable people from the local community of Mala village.
You're planning to use the panchayatraj institutions in this effort. Well, the panchayatraj institutions are themselves in a process of evolution and therefore of transition. So, in this context, do you think that they would be, well geared to really support this kind of information gathering?
I believe that Panchayat Raj institutions will ultimately have to play a crucial role in both documenting and good management of our biological diversity resources. Consider medicinal plants. In Karnataka, surveys have shown that as many as 300 different species are in regular commercial use. But only about 10 of these species are listed as minor forest produce, officially managed by the forest department.
Yes.
There is no information whatsoever on the other 290 species with any government agency today. These species are being harvested today without the larger society deriving any benefits in terms of revenue. There is no management of these resources. Only people who know what is going on are ultimately the local tribals or villagers who are collecting these plants as daily wage laborers working for contractors supplying the pharmaceutical companies. Our idea is to pool together all this information available with these first-hand collectors at panchayat level, and then try to use this information as an important basis for good management of these resources. For instance, in this Mala village for which we have prepared the biodiversity register, our estimate is that as much as 5 lakhs worth of medicinal plants and other forest-based fruit and other produce are being collected from within the limits of the panchayat every year. The local people today receive only very limited daily wages for the collection effort. Now, if the local panchayat, say the Mala panchayat, is authorized to levy some small collection fee on these produce, they could easily generate a revenue of 50,000-60,000, which would be a substantial addition to their normal revenue. It would motivate them to document, to keep track of these resources properly, and perhaps if they are adequately authorized, to make sure that the resources are collected in a sustainable fashion so that this remains a long-term source of revenue. In fact, the Karnataka government is very much thinking along these lines. It has before its consideration a report suggesting that the Panchayat Raj institutions, as they evolve, should take on more and more responsibility for management of natural resources, including biological resources. And of course, this management would call for documentation, but also ensuring that the harvests are properly carried out. So it is our hope that this documentation exercise will provide the necessary basic information which might enable panchayatraj institutions to begin to take on such a role.
I believe the PR Naik committee has made some recommendations for certain amendments to the Panchayat Raj. What would they be exactly?
Yes, Mr. P.R. Naik himself has been very interested in these issues, and he was actively involved in fact, formulating and guiding the project which led to this Panchayat Biodiversity Register of Mala village. His committee, I understand, has recommended that the Panchayat bodies should be authorized to supervise, should be authorized to levy some collection charges on biodiversity resources being exploited from within the panchayat limits. Also that the educational institutions up to the high school level, which are responsibility of Panchayat Raj institutions, should in each district be in fact asked to take on the task of this documentation as a part of regular teaching activities.
Last year, under a project called Lifescape, which was launched by the Indian Academy of Sciences to mark the birth centenary of Dr. Salim Ali, the noted ornithologist, you had proposed that high school and university students, besides teachers, could be enlisted to reliably identify many of the Indian species across the country and in turn help feed information into a national system for monitoring ongoing changes in India's lifescape, and also, of course, thereby helping the conservation effort. Would there be any effort to coordinate these various initiatives, for example, this pilot where you're involving the village folk and the local people, and the other initiative where you want to enlist the help of students in university, academics and so on?
Yes, our idea is to try, in fact, to relate these various kinds of initiatives for them to work together. As I mentioned earlier, I think it would be ideal if the formally trained ecologists work in a symbiotic fashion with the practical ecologists. And for this to happen, what we need to do is that the practical ecologists be helped to translate their knowledge into the knowledge acceptable to the modern scientific system. After all, the local people may know local names of the medicinal plants and perhaps a great deal about the medicinal plants they are collecting. But these local names vary a great deal from locality to locality. Even within the state of Karnataka, the very different names may be used, say in Uttar Kannada as opposed to Mysore. And unless there is a standardization and an equivalence established between, say, these various local names for medicinal plants and the botanical names, then the information cannot be put to proper use. So the attempt of this project Lifescape that you mentioned is to develop resource material which would enable school teachers, school students, college teachers, college students to reliably identify a set of species which are of immediate relevance, which we need to focus on proper management right away, such as medicinal plants or such as wild relatives of cultivated plants. So what we hope to do is through this project to develop good material, resource material, which would help teachers, students identify these species properly, and then correlate this with what the local, say, collectors of medicinal plants or local fisher folk are able to tell them. So these programs would in fact work together.
As you said earlier, India is one of the world's 12 mega diversity countries, and yet only 20% of the species, Indian species, have been known to be scientifically described. So what do you expect Karnataka's potential to be in this context, in terms of untapped, unlisted?
It depends. Now, the 20% which are described tend to be groups which are better known. For instance, flowering plants. And as far as, let us say, medicinal plants are concerned, as I said, 300 species of Karnataka are already in commercial use. It is possible that many more species might have potential, but by and large these would be known. What is not known are organisms which are smaller animals, for instance, spiders. And their potential is only now beginning to be realized. For instance, all species of spiders have some venoms, which they use to paralyze their prey. Medicinal firms are discovering that many of these venoms might have important application in treatment of neural diseases. But these are kinds of applications which are largely of the future. And it is certainly possible that there may be hundreds of species of small spiders in Karnataka, some of whom may have a venom which may find some very interesting application. Undoubtedly, most of these are undescribed. So this is something, of course, which would require much more serious scientific effort. And it is also true that most of these spiders will be not known to local people also, and not only to, and of course not known to scientists as well. So this would be a different kind of effort which we'll have to mount, which would have to be much more serious, sophisticated scientific effort. But as I said, there are other resources such as medicinal plants where the unknown is not so much in terms of species level identification and so on. What is needed is detailed locality by locality monitoring, where it is very important to get local people involved, and that is the kind of effort our People's Biodiversity Register is talking about.
Finally, I think to bring all these various efforts together, I mean, it is a mammoth task before the country, and it is one that is acquiring urgency in the light of what you said earlier. So in that context, finally, I think much would depend on the government's willingness to see this implemented as policy. How confident are you that that will happen?
Well, I think both the state governments and the government of India are likely to be quite responsive. Finally, I think it will not depend so much on government, but on all our individual efforts to get such a program going. Now, my own experience over the last several years working especially with many college teachers and students in smaller towns and villages has shown that given an opportunity, there is a tremendous enthusiasm which can be unleashed to work on these kinds of programs. So if we can begin to make this transition and get people involved in first-hand observations on live organisms which they can see with their own eyes, which are day-to-day familiar to them, then a great deal of grassroots enthusiasm amongst biology teachers, students, I believe, can be unleashed. And I think there are excellent possibilities. And I think once this happens, which I am confident could happen, I think the governments would certainly support such an effort.
I'm sure our listeners too would share your optimism in this regard, Dr. Gadgil. Thank you so much for sparing time to be with us here today.
Thank you.
You were listening to an interview with Dr. Madhav Gadgil on documenting biodiversity. Interviewing him was Sharitha Rai, Special Correspondent, Indian Express. This broadcast came to you from the studios of All India Radio, Bangalore.